Hello, everyone. My name is Michelle Dingle, and I'd like to welcome you to the last session of the 2024 Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project's Black History Month series, Many Rivers to Cross the African Diaspora. This week, the topic is preservation, culture, and commemoration, and our guests are Melanie Maldonado and Omar Eaton-Martinez. This too will be another great conversation. And of course, I'm going to introduce them both properly. Melanie describes herself as an artivist and is the founder of PROPA, the Puerto Rican Organization for the Performing Arts. Her work centers on creating access for communities and families to remember and honor the legacies of their ancestors. In 2011, she, along with other members of PROPA, spearheaded programming events at ancestral spaces in Puerto Rico, and in 2018 led a first of its kind multi-city tour of sites of importance for African diasporic gatherings and traditional practices. In 2019, work began to install plaques at these locations. In 2023, PROPA became an affiliate of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project, and in September held an ancestral remembrance ceremony at Humacao, Puerto Rico. Welcome, Melanie. All right, Omar Eaton-Martinez is Senior Vice President for Historic Sites at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He is responsible for the preservation, interpretation, and overall stewardship of 28 U.S. historic sites, addressing the importance of understanding how past events impact and inform how we plan the future. Mr. Martinez says our clarion call as historic preservationists, public historians, and museum professionals is to connect the dots by providing immersive experiences that disrupt singular history so that we can tell the full American story. After working as a teacher in New York and Washington, D.C., he held positions at Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, the National Park Service, and the Office of the National Museum of the American Latino Commission. He also led Prince George's County's historical resources, which includes historical house museums, archaeological parks, an aviation museum, and the Black History program. His strength is building coalitions to support equity, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion in museums and cultural institutions. Now, among his research interests are Afro-Latinx identity in museum exhibitions and hip-hop history, culture, and education. And moreover, he has supported public history projects centering on Blackness in Puerto Rico. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for inviting me to be here.
No problem. All right, we've got a lot to cover this session. I want to encourage everyone to please leave any comments you may have in the chat feature, but for any specific questions that you would like the panel to answer, please put them in the Q&A section of this meeting. That will allow us to better see all the questions that come in. Questions in the chat feature just tend to get lost with all the other chatter. So we definitely want to keep the chatter in the chat and push all questions to Q&A. Also, start putting your questions in as they come so that when we get to those when we get to the Q&A portion of this program, we can jump right in on those questions. All right, I think we are ready to begin. Melanie, Omar, you ready to start?
Yes, finally found the unmute button here.
Great. All right, Melanie, I'm going to start with you because I did introduce you as an artivist. So tell me exactly, what does the term artivist mean?
Well, for me, it means using my art, using my engagement with the arts, using my connections in the arts, creating experiences that are artful and just very joyful, really. Because I feel that the purpose of art is, one of the purposes is to bring us joy. In using these experiences to engage, to bring consciousness, to elevate a topic, to bring attention to connect people. For me, using art, using the different forms of art that have been part of my life and continue to be so, to bring important consciousness to topics that I'm working on, topics that I feel are that are overlooked, is what drives my work.
That's great. I love that term. I know you gave me another term also earlier when we were chatting. Do you want to bring that one up too? Because I thought that was also a very cool twist on the word.
Yes. So I will have to say, I consider Omar an artivist also. And no, it's because I had him on a panel of artivists. But a friend of mine who I think is listening in tonight, Diogenes Ballester in Ponce, Puerto Rico, he uses a term called, that he refers to as archaeology, and refers to himself as an archaeologist. So I, as we were talking about artivism right before the panel started, I said, I think I'm beginning to consider myself an archaeologist as well.
All right. All right, my next question, and either one of you all can take this. What are the criteria for determining what a historic site is? Let's start with that. And then if you can follow up, what input does descendant communities have in making that decision to any of that? Like, do you get pushback from the descendant communities? Do you get help? Let's talk about that a little bit. Who'd like to take that first?
I'll defer to Omar here.
Well, criteria for determining the historic site, that question can only be answered, or will be answered differently by depending on who you ask. I think from a more standards-based hegemonic view of government saying this is the way it is, people will tell you that it has to be listed on a register, some type of a state register, local register, or preferably the National Register for Historic Places. And usually you have to, there used to be a number that you say has to be at least 50 years old, and you have to be able to give some justification of its historical relevance. I would say that these criteria should really be driven by the community whose stories this site represents, and they should have some agency in that. I think with the National Trust right now, we are looking at different ways to consider possibly expanding our portfolio of trust sites, which we have 28 in number, and they exist in 3 different categories: ones that we own and operate, ones that we own and someone else operates as a co-steward, and then ones that are affiliates. We're just partners and we share best practices and provide technical assistance. And you know, I think one of the things that we're really looking at is how can we tell the full American story? Well, I don't think any one entity can make that determination, that criteria in isolation. And if we continue to go down that path of allowing one agency that doesn't represent the masses, doesn't represent all the different intersectional identities and experiences that make up what we call the United States of America, then we're always going to have a problem with these criteria. I think in order to really engage with this, what we've been doing, we sort of look at different groups of our sites in buckets. And so we have 7 of our 28 sites, or we consider sites of enslavement. And, you know, in 2018, there was a summit that was funded by the National Trust, specifically through the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. It was a summit that was hosted over 2.5 days at James Madison's Montpelier. I was actually not working for the trust at that point, but I did participate in an independent capacity. And as a result of that meeting, we created a rubric so that people can interpret the history and the legacies that come from enslavement with descendant communities. And I think that as people started to dig into that, then you started to find out that you really needed a way to equitably give voice and agency to the descendants so that they can be equal or driving participants in how these sites are identified, stewarded, and interpreted, and ultimately preserved. And so, long answer for that, but it really just depends on who you're asking and what context that you mean. But I think that there's room for growth in that, even in those existing answers.
So I know you mentioned with the criteria that there are some very set ones that you think aren't necessarily the best, right? Because it should be based off of the descendants and what their needs are. Do you feel like you're getting any movement when you kind of suggest that, or is it like, no, these are staunch rules that we're going to keep in place?
I think there's movement. I
Okay.
mean, even from looking at certain structures, and typically people, organizations like ours have value looking at structures that are unique, that are done by certain designers, have a certain design, a certain the design itself has an historical uniqueness. But now we're looking at vernacular structures, right? Because some of these structures just tell the stories that we need them to tell. Like, we're looking at
Yeah.
preserving heritage through telling stories through these structures,
Right.
through the landscapes, right? Through the collections that make up these houses and these different buildings. And so we have to think more expansively and stop thinking so narrowly.
All right. All right, next question. Tell us
Can I?
about your work. Oh, yeah, you want to add on?
Yes, please. Yes,
Yeah.
please. I come from a kind of the other end of the spectrum, and this work, really grassroots approach, working directly with families and individuals, community cultural centers, and other entities on the ground in these spaces that have been long overlooked, long invisibilized by gentrification and other movements of modernization over the decades, over the centuries, really. And in doing the work, the identification of the spaces has come from the very individuals that you questioned. Are they a part of these processes? So in my work, in interviewing them, they're the ones who have told me, oh, over there, my grandfather used to host bomba dances. Over there, my grandmother used to host her friends, and they would create petticoats that they would wear at the bomba dances. Over there, I was born there, and that was a sundry shop. It was a kind of a catch-all shop along the local rail system that connected the different sugar mills. And the owner used to host bomba dances there. So the community is the one that's identifying these spaces that in Puerto Rico, and Omar can speak to this as well. Puerto Rico does not have a history of identifying, visibilizing, and even celebrating Black history sites. So really, there aren't these destinations that we can drive to, that we can map out and say, hey, next time you visit, if you have some free time, drive by and go see this marker, go see this house. Those sites are not identified. They are not, they haven't been highlighted for us to be able to direct some. And I think we were talking about that, Michelle. Somebody's
Yeah.
asking a similar
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, and actually it kind of goes into the question, around what some of your biggest challenges are, right? We talked about that things are just not visible in Puerto Rico. Is that do you think that is your biggest challenge, or is there like a lot of red tape because people don't want to recognize those historic sites as well, right? So tell me, both of you all, because I'm sure you all have different perspectives, or maybe you don't, I don't know. Maybe there's some things that are very similar, but tell me what you see as some of your biggest challenges facing those historic sites and the cultural heritage field today.
Okay, I'll just pick up from where I was leading. There is, I don't know if I would say, well, in some cases, there's definitely resistance, bureaucratic, red tape, full on opposition. But in large part, really, there's just a disconnection there's a misunderstanding, there's an unknowing of this history, maybe there's a whisper, an echo, people might remember a name. Even I was in Arroyo, and I'll talk about this work when I show the pictures later, but being in Arroyo, and I remember talking about one of the historic sites there, the ruins of a local plantation, and talking about it with a name that had been given by the original owner. And somebody from the audience who was local corrected me and said, no, sorry, this is what it's called. And I said, if you just give me a minute, I'm gonna actually explain how we get there. So there really just sometimes is a disconnection from the knowledge that surrounds this, in large part because after abolition and emancipation in Puerto Rico, 2 decades later, we have recolonization.
Yeah.
And so with that recolonization, then becomes the erasure, the continued, the furtherance of the erasure of these histories and the herstories related to these sites.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I look at it as well is, I've always focused my work in cultural spaces around museums, and I may use museums and preservation interchangeably, just a preface what I'm about to say, but museums itself, they're colonial projects. Preservation as a sector in a traditional context is also a colonial project. And so when you think about it that way, then you understand what structures and what entities has driven it to this point. And so now that these two entities, museums and preservationists, the larger art and cultural world, are starting to challenge these notions, then it becomes disruptive. And so there's not, like in a place like Puerto Rico, there's not a bunch of foundations that are focused on Puerto Rico and giving money to them, right? So that they can put the proper stewardship in these sites. And there's not a bunch of commissions set up to help people push against the traditional gazes and views on what preservation looks like and what heritage keeping looks like. So you have to have freedom fighters like Melanie go out there and forge alliances through grassroots methods and build from there. And then, of course, what usually happens is that the hegemony comes later and sees that work is productive, and then they kind of swoop in, right? And so what we're trying to do now is that there's some recognition from some of these institutions, and I would include mine, that is happening. So now we're trying to course correct so that nobody's swooping in, right? We're being proper partners and allies into this work and not trying to take over things, right? And that's going to take a while because the way we're structured is the opposite. And so even though the will is to go left, we're structured to go right. And that takes a lot of good people. That takes people who have the will to slow down and take a larger and more expansive look at the process. And also, it has to have people who have the will to really be humble and allow new voices and different voices to come to the table and drive the work together. And so I think we're coasting that way. But of course, it didn't. Those structures weren't solidified overnight, and they won't be dismantled overnight either.
Yeah. Do you find you're working with local communities, right? They're shaping how your work is coming along. Do you find it hard to get people to come on board and help? Or do you feel like nowadays people are actually willing to come and help to get this information out there versus like, I want to suppress this or I want to silence this a little bit? Do you feel like the local community is more involved or willing to be involved?
Are we talking about Puerto Rico specifically?
Yes.
I'll allow Melanie to go first.
I have to say that every time I've reached out within the community, barring the institutions that sometimes are oftentimes the gatekeepers, but really in the community, when I've reached out and talked to folks about this, engaged them, brought them on to work on a project, the reception has always been there. A lot of times they just say, well, I drive by this all the time. I've heard that word, I've heard that name. I didn't realize. Yes, I would like to be part of celebrating this, identifying this space, making sure that folks know that we're connected to this land in this way, for sure. So people, I've even had people come from stateside, folks that are based stateside, and come to the island to help support different projects that are related to this work of visibility.
That's good. It's good to hear.
I would say, from my experience, I think that there's an awareness happening, but I think there has to be more done to create awareness around the structures that have been disruptive to get these stories put forth in the center. I think that on the island, you have the colonialism that has a direct connection to the racism and the colorism. And so what you'll see it's not that you don't see preservation on the island, but you see preservation of Spain, right? In Spain are two colonizers ago. But the most famous historic sites, the ones that are labeled the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, run by the National Park Service and some run by the government of Puerto Rico, are really tributes to Spain. They're not necessarily expressive of what Puerto Rico is and has become. I think that when you look at a place like El Ancon and Loíza, that it would be considered in most preservation terms a very vernacular building, like it's like a regular thing. But that place meant something to Puerto Rico, especially Loíza, which is a famous place known for a lot of African descendant folks who lived in that space, especially post-emancipation, but probably prior to that as well. And I always like to add that, like, there were Black people throughout the island. It wasn't just Loíza, right? But that space was a space that was a historic barge that allowed that group to go over to San Juan because there was no bridge at that point. And so there's all kinds of stories generationally that come. I talk to my mother about it all the time when she grew up on the island. And so now when the bridge came in, it made the historic barge basically not as significant, and it kind of fell to disrepair. But then the family that was running the barge picked it back up and started to preserve it. And they did what we call an adaptive reuse of that barge. And now it's a beautiful gallery. It celebrates Black culture on the island through different forms of art. And it does a lot of STEM work around mangrove restoration. So it has to deal with the climate as well. And it mixes those things effortlessly, right? Because only in Western society do we separate those things anyway. And so they rebuked all that, and they wonderfully, with very little, put something beautiful together that now is a value add to the community. And now the nation is catching on. And I'm happy to say that that space in particular is one of the new grantees for the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, and we also gave it a National Preservation Award for its work on its interpretation and community engagement. So, I mean, these things are possible, but this is something new, right? And I hope to see much more of it on the island over the next years.
Yes, I want to just go back. First of all, thank you. They are so deserving of that work. So thank you, Omar, for seeing them and supporting them. I know that you're a big supporter of their work. I want to go back and say, while the community at the ground level, the folks that are connected to the sites that I work with always say yes, the truth is, if the country at large, if Puerto Rico at large really supported this work, there would be funds, there would be press, there would be more people attending my events. It wouldn't be a small size crowd, truly, if there was larger and broader support. So the truth is, we are still battling racism. We're still battling an erasure, a continued attempt to erase, to put behind, to say that was That was during the time of Spain's colonization. Like, let's look forward. There are all of these efforts to keep us from looking back, to keep us from participating in Sankofa in that way. But
Mm.
for sure, they're at the local, at the immediate level, there's wide reception. We still struggle, though, to be
Yeah.
seen outside of those connections.
Thank you. All right, so looking forward, what are you guys planning in 2024 in terms of acknowledging this African history? And like, what is your relationship with other locations like the Caribbean? And are you hopeful that work such as yours will bring your desired outcome?
Well, I'll say, so I started to talk about how we sort of have we do have a consortium of sites of enslavement within our larger 28 that are 7 in number. And we call that the Shine Group. But there's also what we call the Rise Group. This is all started by our Director of Interpretation Education, Elon Cook Lee. And I have to lift up her name because she's done such great work with this. That she extended that alliance, not just from the 7 sites that are in the United States, but now we have sites in the Caribbean. We have sites of enslavement in the Caribbean, and also sites of slave traders, historic sites of slave traders in Europe. And now that there's a larger transatlantic connection now to these sites. And so now that we're connected, there's an opportunity for us not to only build on the research that comes from those sites, but obviously the interpretation and the stories that we tell that allow us and to tell not just the United States, but the whole world to see the humanity in Black people, right? And to start to disrupt and rebuke this anti-Blackness movement that's been going on for so long. And so that's really the joy of doing this work, to continue to build that out in this year, and hopefully get some more support. We have a partner in that also, the International National Trust Organization, which I just joined their board this past year. And that organization unites all the national trusts across the globe. And so that's our partner in creating these types of alliances. So really, the sky's the limit.
Fantastic. I can talk in terms of PROPA. PROPA is, since 2019, as you mentioned, PROPA has begun putting up historic markers. It really, after Hurricane Maria, and let me pause. In 2011, I moved a major event, the Bomba Research Conference, from Chicago to the island with the intention of utilizing historic sites as classrooms, as learning laboratories. And so we were having these kinds of panel discussions in cemeteries, under trees, in carports, on street corners, anywhere that tied the content to practice. And in visiting the island within a year of Hurricane Maria, and seeing how many of the sites that I'd already utilized for this kind of programming had been destroyed, had been had experienced irreparable damage, I felt the urgency to visualize them even further by putting some kind of placard on them, and not waiting for a national body. Omar, we love you. You're an important voice for us. We just don't have, locally in Puerto Rico, we don't have an ally like you who's working to help make these sites kind of on a broader sense, kind of maybe blurring the lines of these requirements that you identified at the beginning that are being reconsidered. But there isn't a body, there isn't an institution that's thinking about Black history sites in Puerto Rico, on the island. And so PROPA decided, there is no body. We're going to create our own historic marker, and we're going to begin visualizing these sites so that when gentrification comes, as demolition comes in the wake of the lack of FEMA funds after Hurricane Maria, maybe people will think twice about raising this site. Maybe they'll think twice about demolishing and replacing this structure. And so in that wave, we are pushing forward and placing markers throughout the island, we will definitely place another marker within the next year, year and a half. Probably, I hope, if all goes well, maybe up to 5. In 2023, we began working with the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. We held our first ceremony. We're still trying to get the permissions to place the placard. If we talk about support and the lack of support being a kind of resistance, we're in that space right now, struggling to get the permissions to further visibilize one of these sites. We have already begun planning for the ceremony, and so I'm so happy this evening to be able to announce that on May 4th, we will be holding our next ceremony in collaboration with the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project in Ponce to tell the story, to help tell the story, and to honor the ancestors who were captive on a ship that arrived in Ponce in 1818. So we're really excited about that. We have a committee and a team. Omar was on our committee for Humacao, which was the ceremony that was held over Labor Day weekend. We have a different committee for the ceremony in May, and we are eagerly preparing for that ceremony
Was
now.
this breaking news, Melanie? Was this breaking
news?
All right. Well, look, I'm going to transition to you now because I know you have some pictures that you want to talk to. And then straight from the pictures, we're going to go to Q&A. Okay. So for those who have not, Melanie, while you're getting ready to share your screen, I'm just going to let those who are listening in to put their questions in the Q&A because right after these pictures, we're going to go straight to Q&A.
Okay. So, whoops, trying to, I don't know if you all can see this. Okay, so this project of Propas is called Lugares Históricos, which literally translates, not super creative, but it really means historic sites. And so I felt the need just to begin using that terminology early on in 2011, because of the lack of a local culture that visibilized Black history sites, I felt like I really needed to put that language forward. So just to review, I'm sorry, can you see that?
I can see your screen. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful, because I like a pop-up that I can't get rid of. So this was the interfaith portion of our ceremony in Humacao. That particular ship left off what is today the Angolan coast with over 1,000 captives from the area of the Congo River. You can see we had practitioners of Capoeira Angola who opened up our space and invited ancestors through this traditional instrument from Angola called the berimbau. We had our land acknowledgement here with the United Confederation of Taino People. And then we incorporated elements of different faith practices that would have been represented on the ship or would have been represented in the population of Africans or Afro-descendants already on the island. And so we had a babalao from the practice of Ifa. We had a nana in the practice, the traditional medicine of the Bono people of Ghana. And then we had a tata of the Congo-derived practice of Palomayombe. And then a espiritista or spiritist in representation of that practice in the diaspora. Here you can see that we honored the captive lost at sea. And I had an opportunity to use genealogy in terms, going back to the conversation on descendant communities. As a genealogist, I've worked with probably at this point hundreds of families, thousands of individuals within those trees in archival records and through oral history. But in this work, I was able to connect 2 families for whom I had already conducted their genealogies to either enslavers who had enslaved their ancestors or enslavers who had requested emancipated people from this ship, from this illegal slave ship, to come work as indentured servants on their plantations. So the work of making these connections, the work of showing that we have the resources to begin putting these pieces together is part of how we tell the story, how we engage people so that they feel connected to and in part responsible for how we move forward in terms of celebrating and honoring these ancestors. We wrapped up that particular ceremony at a cemetery, at a local cemetery, in representation of at the ceremony. This particular cemetery represented another cemetery that no longer exists. And here we honored the 79 Africans who were buried there within the first 3 weeks of the arrival of that particular ship. I'm going to move on just to some of the other work that PROPA has done in Puerto Rico. Here you can see a pamphlet that was created by one of my collaborators in the southern town of Arroyo, and I'm going to just show you a deep dive on some, or take a deep dive with you on some of the work done in one particular town, this town of Arroyo. In this pamphlet, they went on to describe how before our work with them in 2013, they had not had a representation of this live practice in their community for more than 50 years. And part of that work with them was to visit ruins that are kind of off to the distance here. This is a former plantation of Edward Lind, who was the son-in-law of Samuel Morse of the Telegraph. And from where Samuel Morse tested the telegraph for the first time outside of the United States, right here on this land, right here in this town. And so I'm here with some of the descendants of a bomba drummer who, from the early 1900s, whose mother had been enslaved at this site. Okay. Here we have one of the events that we organized right in front of the city hall there in this town, and historic bomba dances were held here about 100 years ago, 75 years ago or so. Here we are in that 2018 multi-city tour. We stopped in front of the home of a dancer who's not remembered, whose name was lost over time, but whose legacy was incredibly important in this community and is still remembered in this community. She was also the partner, the dancing partner of the drummer whose descendants I showed in a previous slide. Here on the left is the dedication of one of those markers in the town of Arroyo, with some of the descendants of many different bomba practitioners. And there on the right is Doña Malta. She's my buddy, one of my besties. And Doña Malta is a descendant of, when I got started in this tradition over 20 years ago, her grandfather's name was still resounding as the most celebrated bomba practitioner in terms of drumming, the most celebrated bomba drummer of the early 1900s. And here we dedicated a plaque not too far from where his own mother had been enslaved, and the plaque is dedicated to her. Here, and I'm winding down, I just have a couple more. Here we are cleaning a batey or patio space of a historic home in Cataño, the home of Domingo Negrón. And you can see in the black and white photos that were taken in 1940 in celebration of the bomba dances that he held at his home. His family has continuously occupied that home since at least 1940. And we were helping restore that patio that you can see right in those black and white photographs. And we also, the very first placard in this placard program was dedicated at this site. Here we're back in the south in a town called Patillas, and we're standing in front of what was the big house of a plantation there called Hacienda Catalina, or Hacienda Plau, by the name of the owners, referred to as by the last name of the owners. here I am giving Doña Wilda, another one of my buddies here, I'm giving her her genealogy and explaining to her how, in using DNA testing and archival research, we were able to connect her ancestors directly to Africa through archival materials and through DNA testing, as I mentioned. And I gave her that information right on the land where several of her ancestors had been enslaved.
Wow.
Finally, down the street, so Doña Wilda, this is where some of her ancestors had been enslaved. And then later, her grandfather lived on a street called Octavio Rivera, colloquially called Calle Los Congos. And here you can see some of the moments in a celebration when we dedicated a placard on that street, Calle Los Congos in Patillas. Just wrapping up here, this is the PROPA's work has also expanded not only to historic sites for Bomba, but also historic sites related to Bomba practitioners. So in this case, you can see in the upper left-hand corner, a tombstone of a Bomba dancer who was active about 100 years ago and who was buried in 1967. A few years ago, the municipality resold her plots without the family's knowledge and destroyed this beautiful tombstone and replaced it with just a hideous piece of concrete and just a tiny slab, and disturbed her remains in doing so.
Wow.
And we felt very compelled to help tell the story of how important it was, one, that we had a tombstone for a practitioner, for a Black woman, for this ancestor, this elder, and two, that we wanted Puerto Rico to know that this was an important site that had been violated. And we held a funeral rite that is a part of the Bomba tradition. It's called a belé. We held a belén right at the gates to the cemetery to help express our disdain, to mourn, to share our grief with the family. So this is part of the work that PROPA has been doing in related to historic sites on the island, throughout the island. And I think I went over 5 minutes.
No, that's fine. We're gonna go. First of all, thank you for that. That was very enlightening. And thank you both for the conversation. We're going to go into Q&A. We've got maybe about 10 to 12 minutes. And we've got about 7 questions right now. I think we can get through them. So we're gonna try to get all of these in. The first question came from Carrie Braxton. She says, I love the fact that more artifacts and historic sites are being captured and saved for Black American history. What regional groups are you with to make these sites more accessible to students and community members?
What regional groups? I don't know. I mean, there's definitely like alliances being built. I mean, there's different people doing this work. I think one of the wonderful things about preservation work, although it has, I mean, there's degrees in it and there's sort of professionalization of it. A lot of the important work are being done by like grassroots people who don't, they pick up preservation because they care about keeping their heritage intact, right? It's not because they went to school for it. But you know, you have national organizations like the National Trust who've been doing preservation work for a long time. You have government organizations at the local level. Everybody has a SHPO who does this work. But in terms of like the grassroots folks, in terms of alliances, you know, one group, and I think Melanie's been engaged with them at a certain level, is the African American Genealogical and Historical Society. They have a chapter group. It's a national organization, but there's a chapter group, and folks who do genealogy, a lot of those same people are doing the preservation work as well because the two go hand in hand. But I think it you know, I don't know if there's like specific regional groups I can point you to, but if you had a specific question about a specific area, a location, I'm sure I can find out for you.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
think, I'm sorry,
No,
in
go
terms
ahead.
of regional groups, I'd have to say the same. I have several partners and collaborators. Their work in particular isn't defined by this kind of preservation work, but because they're concerned about the community, because they are concerned about these issues, they're advocates, they're artivists, archaeologists, and other people just doing this important work. They sign up, they show up, they participate on the island and from the States, folks that come down to show up and participate. So there isn't per se a particular affinity group in Puerto Rico that is involved in this type of work, really specifically dedicated to that, but there are many partners.
All right, I got another question from Anjana Cruz. Hi, working on a Native American site on Long Island. We created a map of the neighborhood and invited people to place a mark where their relatives had lived. And we got stories about how the site had been used, neighbor relations, even how they used or cut across roads and yards. Building on what you're already doing, might something like that work for your ongoing work?
Yeah, I'd have to say I actually have partnered with a project out of the DMV, DC area called Ritmo Resiliente. And through that project, I was invited to sit on a panel with the director, Kojo Johnson, with a group called Remembering You, with a project called Remembering You, or U Street in DC, and the work that they were doing there. So they really had some innovative ideas about doing exactly what you just mentioned, creating an app that would allow people to tell multi-generational stories that connect to a site. So you could go in, you could hear a story that related to something that happened in 1971, and another story from 1996, another story from 1947, and that at this one address, you would have multiple stories that would help you understand the community, its shifts, and all the ways that people experience that particular corridor. We were working on some similar ideas for this Lugares Históricos project, and I'm definitely in conversation about how to map Propa's historic markers throughout the island, how to create some digital tools that will help people give themselves self-guided tours. There's enough content on the markers themselves where if people miss the dedication ceremony, they're able to visit the marker and become educated about what happened at that site.
Yeah, I think digital mapping and using the skills of GIS experts is exactly where we need to be. It's grassroots, but it also connects to the larger national, international network. It provides context to the work that we're doing. We have GIS folks at the National Trust who are working on different projects. And one of the things we've been talking to them about is we have a map that you can go to on our savingplaces.org website and look at our 28 sites. But what I was looking to kind of build out with them is to create sort of an interactive map that not only does an overlay of our 28 sites, but then how do those 28 sites look in conversation with all of our grantees? So we have the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund that has a ton of grantees. We have the Preservation Services and Outreach Division or Department that also has a ton of grantees. And it'd be nice to see where we are over the map of the mainland of the United States and its territories, so that we can really see where we are and build better coalitions, right? Because I think that's what it's about, is to connect the local to the regional, to the national, and ultimately to the international, but to have those different levels so that we can still do work within our capacity. Sometimes we all want to be super international. We have the capacity just to get together our local neighborhood. So let's not get in the way of that. Let's acknowledge that and create a mechanism that allows us to enter into that space at our own capacity and will.
All right, I have a question from Karen Spellman. Does the Expansion Arts program support your cultural preservation effort as they did 25 years ago?
Can you say that one more time, Michelle?
Sure. Does the Expansion Arts program support your cultural preservation effort as they did 25 years ago?
I'm not familiar with it.
I'm not familiar with that either.
All right, we've got more questions coming for you. I have an anonymous question. Can you say a few words about the elder who transitioned recently, who was able to attend the Labor Day ancestral ceremony? What was his experience that day?
I think the person is talking about Dr. Miguel Correa, who was a historian who wrote a book about the majesty and the impact of the majesty to the local Macau community. I had a chance to meet him just a few weeks before the event, at which time he shared his book with me. And he attended the ceremony and really just had wonderful things to say. He was, and I have to say, it is because of his research that we were able to identify the very probable location of where that shipwrecked off the coast of Humacao specifically. So the place where we held the ceremony, we could see the place where the ship shipwrecked, but it wasn't the exact location. But it's because of his work that we were able to identify that. So we're really great. I was very grateful to have him there that day. Very grateful to have him participate and see that all these folks that had gathered from throughout the island, from throughout the local Macau community who had come from the US-based diaspora, were there to celebrate story of a ship whose story he had been telling for quite a long time. So we remain grateful to him.
All right, we've got about 2 or 3 more minutes, and we still have questions for you. Here's a question from John Bloomfield. Are the new potential partners, the structure, enclaves, institutions, and agencies, do they have representation from the grassroots folks that bring the enthusiasm and eagerness to learn, identify, and celebrate these new spaces and legacies?
Well, there's always gatherings and different associations that brings some of these folks together. So my organization, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is at savingplaces.org, has a national conference that brings people together that kind of talk about the different important preservation issues, anything from equity and inclusion to justice center work to climate justice and how that impacts preservation work, to awareness and those types of different things. But there's also local preservation conferences as well. There's some places that have SHPOs, as I mentioned earlier, and SHPO stands for State Historic Preservation Office. And then there's TIPOs, Tribal Preservation Offices. Those tend to be government-run organizations. We have the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation. It's a national organization that's a government-run entity, a federal-run entity. But then you also have some that are nonprofit, like in the state of Maryland where I live, we have Preservation Maryland. You have different places like in Illinois, is Landmark Illinois. So there's different entities from government to nonprofit that are making certain efforts to bring this together. But I think the level of engagement and the level of diversity of groups and audiences may vary depending on where you go in the country.
Are there grant funds available to connect historical programs and sites to community and student groups?
I would imagine. I mean, that's I would need to know more to make sure, but I would think if I'm thinking broadly and expansively about what that could be, yes, there's grants again at the trust under the preservation services and outreach. If you go on to savingplaces.org, there's a bunch of grant programs either under preservation services and outreach or the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, which has, again, I would say has funded El Ancon, Casa Cortijo, but it also funded a couple of years ago La Hacienda Esperanza Manatí, which is a plantation in Puerto Rico. And so we're hoping that we'll continue to support those type of preservation projects in Puerto Rico and beyond. But that is just for people's clarity. I'm happy to connect you with those folks. That's outside of my purview. I don't do grant making as part of my job program.
All right, we're gonna have to stop the questions at this point. We have about 4 more minutes. I wanted to make sure that I thanked both you, Omar and Melanie, for another great conversation. Thank you so much. I do want to ask you, maybe there's something that you would like to say that we didn't get to say in this conversation. I'm going to give you all maybe 30 seconds for a quick closing remark, if you have anything. So Melanie, Omar, is there anything you're doing, anything you want to say before we officially close this out?
I'd like to say, just on this, on the heels of this conversation about funding, in my work, a lot of what we do, a lot of what Propa has done for over 20 years now is grassroots. So when you see that GoFundMe campaign, when you see when you see a request for support, the grassroots projects need that help. And yes, there are grant funds from major entities, from humanities endowments and foundations and other organizations that may have interest. It's highly competitive. It's a rigorous process. The timeline doesn't always match up with programming. So when at a grassroots level, when there is an opportunity to support, I encourage you to do so. The work's being done. There are folks on the ground with their hands kind of in it, doing exactly what needs to be done. So when you have a chance, help out.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's many funding opportunities nationally and locally, but I also want to continue to riff off of Melanie's great work in helping people be inspired by this grassroots self-determined movement. This is how it happens. I mean, I think that there's a role, always will be a role for a national trust. There'll always be a role for a Mellon Foundation and other philanthropic places to support the work, but it begins and ends with you. And you have to decide how much you believe and value your heritage, and you have to create awareness and make noise. And I guarantee you, every time I meet somebody who's done preservation work, who's doing preservation work that's impactful and creating new models of movement making and coalition building, it's hardly ever anybody who has a degree in historic preservation. It's you who cares about these stories. And so I just encourage you to continue to make noise, to continue to build coalition and work together on these issues and support one another.
All right, thank you both. Thank you so much. All right, this February series of the African Diaspora has only scratched the surface. In 2024, the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project will continue to explore diasporic shared history, cultural origins, memory work, and issues related to preservation and reparation throughout the year. Thank you all for joining us today. And as we end our 2024 Black History Month series, I truly hope you enjoyed this session and the previous 3. For those who may want to view any of those sessions, including this one, they are available on our YouTube channel and Facebook page. I also want to thank Ann Chen, Ann Cobb, Nick Huster, the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project Board, and all who have made this programming happen. Now, there's just a couple of things that I want to mention before we end. First, if you have any questions, please contact the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project at middlepassagemarkers@gmail.com. And second, for the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project to continue this level of programming, we do need your support, not only financially, but also with your involvement and appreciation of the significance of this work. To support the research, promotion, and the sharing of the history of our ancestors, there are several ways to donate. Number one, you can donate through PayPal or Giftbutter. The links to both are on our website, middlepassageproject.org. You can mail your donation to the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. That is P.O. Box 3071 in Jacksonville, Florida, and that zip code is 32206. And we also have a Venmo account where you can donate directly to our organization. And that information is all on the screen. My name is Michelle Dingle. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you all. Until next time, thanks.